Hello and welcome back to WePC. My name is Will and today we're going to show you how to build a gaming PC. Today we're working on a $1,200 gaming PC build. We have the Ryzen 3600, MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi, the Asus ROG Strix 5700 XT. As well as this we have 16 gig of 3600 speed XPG RAM, a Sabrent 1TB PCIe 4 SSD, the 650 Corsair TX semi-modular PSU, and we have an extra Be Quiet fan case. This is for our Phanteks P400. Today's build is perfect for 1080p and 1440p gaming. All these parts are in the YouTube description below. If you need any more help, you can head over to wepc.com and check out our How to Build a Gaming PC guide. Today we're going to be using the iFixit PC build kit. Inside here you get a wide variety of tools. The most important though is the screwdriver, you can see here. As well as the variety of heads that it comes with. When building your PC, it's important to use a magnetic screwdriver. It helps to not lose screws, which can become an absolute nightmare later on when you're building your PC. Today we're going to be using the MSI MPG X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi motherboard. So let's open it up. When you open your motherboard, you'll find that it's in an anti-static bag. Some people are a little bit scared when handling PC components, but you really don't need to be with the motherboard. It is quite durable. What we usually start to do is, first thing first, is get the motherboard out. If you're using 2.5-inch SSDs, then you'll need the SATA cables, which are here. For our build, we're using the PCIe 4 SSD, so we won't need these. If you have a Wi-Fi motherboard, then you'll sometimes get the Wi-Fi antennas, which either look like this or are sometimes screw wired if you're using an Asus motherboard. And then you also have your trusty motherboard manual, which you can refer to if you need to. You also have the SSD screws, which you see here in this small bag. This is basically to screw your NVMe SSD or your PCIe 4 SSD to your motherboard. So let's get the motherboard out of the anti-static bag. I always use the motherboard box to begin assembling the PC, as does many others. So there we have it, there's a motherboard. If you're a first time builder, you might be daunted by the look of the motherboard, but don't be, it's very simple. We're going to just talk through each of the areas of the motherboard and why they're important. So let's get started. First up, we have our CPU socket. This is a AMD motherboard, it's an X570 motherboard, so it's compatible with 2nd and 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. If you're building an Intel PC, then you'll have an Intel motherboard, but all of them are quite similar. So first off, CPU socket. This is obviously where your CPU goes. As well as this, you have your RAM slots. So most motherboards come with 4 RAM slots. You have your clips on the side, which obviously you need to open once you actually put the RAM in, and then close them up. Again, we'll go through this in more detail later. We also have our 24 pin, which is going to be connected directly to your PSU, as well as our 8 pin here, which is going to be directly connected to your PSU. This is the CPU, and this is for the motherboard. We have our heatsink here for our SSD. So this is for NVMe M2 SSDs, or in this case PCIe 4 SSDs. You also have a secondary PCIe NVMe SSD slot here. For this build though, we want to use a primary, which is the one which the heatsink is. As well as this, we have our PCIe 4, which is for the graphics card. We have 1 and 2. This is our primary and our secondary. We have our fan headers down here, which obviously are important for plugging our fans into, whether you're using an AIO or just fan cases. We have our HD audio, which will be plugged into our PC case. We have our USB, which is here, and our USB 3, which again is for plugging into our front panel of the PC case basically. Finally, we have our front panel power switches, which basically are for power LED, HD LED, and power on and off. We have our SATA ports here, which are for SSDs and HDDs. And lastly, we have our I/O panel on the back. First off, we're going to put the CPU into the motherboard. When handling your CPU, you need to be careful about touching the pins on the bottom of the CPU. Typically, you want to just take it by the sides, like this, and then maybe just reaffirm that grip so you don't drop it. When looking at the motherboard, you need to open up the arm here, pull it up to the top, and then with AMD CPUs, you have a little arrow here. Basically what this references is the way in which it should be placed into the motherboard. So on AMD motherboards, you basically line it up with this little circle here. So we just place this in, applying no force, and there we go. Kind of falls in on its own, and then push this arm back down. There is a little bit of resistance on the arm, but don't worry, once you've actually heard it fall into place, then it's fine. The next step is to insert the RAM into the motherboard. For this build, we're using 2 sticks of 8GB DDR4 3600 speed XPG RAM. And for this, we basically line up the notch in the RAM here with the notch on the motherboard. If you're using dual channel RAM, then you want to use the 2nd and 4th. Again, you can reference this in the motherboard manual, but generally speaking, it's the 2nd and 4th. So line it up, make sure the notch there is lined up with the notch on the motherboard, and then apply a little bit of pressure, and you should hear the click, and that means it's in. So I'll just do the same again with our 2nd stick here. Again, should hear a little click, and again, I have to apply a little bit of pressure. A lot of people feel slightly uncomfortable when applying pressure to the RAM sticks, but as long as you've marked the notch on the RAM with the notch on the motherboard, you should be very set to go, should be easy. Next up, we're going to be installing our 1TB Sabrent PCIe 4 SSD. To begin with, we need to remove the heatsink that is on top of the motherboard right here. For that, we'll be using our screwdriver. Magnetic. When removing the heatsink from the SSD for the first time, you'll notice on the back of this, there'll be a little bit of plastic which you need to peel off. Now we're going to take our Sabrent 1TB PCIe 4 SSD and insert it into our SSD port here. You'll also notice a small notch there, which again, you can also see on the motherboard itself. It shouldn't take much to push this in. And again, nice little click. Next up, you need to take your motherboard screw, which comes in a motherboard box, and then we simply screw this in to keep the SSD in place, and then reposition the SSD heatsink over the top. Line up the screw holes, take our 3 screws, and simply screw them back in place. Really easy. Whoops. And that's why you need a magnetic screwdriver, because it's incredibly easy to lose these tiny screws. The last one usually has to line up with a small screw socket underneath. Might take a slight bit of movement, but should be relatively easy to do. And there we have it. We have our CPU, RAM and SSD all in our motherboard. We are using the Fantex P400 DRGB case, which comes with 3 120mm fans on the front, all of which are RGB. When selecting your PC case, you need to keep in mind the size of the GPU and also the size of the motherboard that you're using. To start preparing the case, we're going to take off this tempered glass side panel. Inside the PC case, you'll find a variety of grommets, which are these here. Obviously holes in the bottom for the wires going to the motherboard, and several screw fixings, again depending on the case that you're using. You'll also find space at the back for an exhaust fan, and again depending on the case, potentially you'll find screw fixings up here for optional exhaust fans for the top. On this particular case, we have these removable filters on the top and one that slides from the bottom. Next, we're going to take off the side panel. Most PC cases come with thumb screws. Now, it's debatable whether or not these thumb screws are actually able to unscrew with your thumb. Some are, some aren't. So it's always worth having your screwdriver at your side just in case. Come on. Fantex and a few other PC case brands come with a box of screws and other accessories that you can use for screwing in your motherboard, as well as any additional SSDs, and also your screws for your PSU, as well as a few other extra screws and cable ties as well. On this side of the PC, we have our areas here for SSDs, so these for 2.5-inch SSDs if you're using them. We also have sliding trays here for your HDDs. You can also screw in your SSDs here if you want to. If you want to create more space in the bottom of your PC case, a lot of these HDD trays are also removable, as is with the Vantex P400. The screws are on the bottom and on the top, so you just remove them, and then it gives you a little bit of extra space at the bottom here for cables and cable management. Depending again on the type of case you're using, some cases come with cable management attached. This one has Velcro strips, as well as little clips here to basically do cable ties, so you can tidy up your cables after you've actually put the PC in there. With every PC case that you get, you're going to get a variety of cables, of which most route through to these front I/O ports. On all of your PC cases, you're going to get a variety of buttons and ports on the front. On the Vantex P400 specifically, we have obviously the power button, we have two USB 2.0, we have our headphone in, mic in, and then underneath here we have an assortment of buttons, of which are used for the RGB specifically, to change the RGB of the fans. When you're beginning your PC build, you might find these a little bit scary, a bit daunting, but they are very easy to work out. Here we have our USB 3.0. As well as this, we have our front panel, which are the HDD, LED, power switch, and reset switch. As well as this, we have our HD audio, which again comes with pretty much every PC case. I've yet to see a PC case without HD audio. Depending on the case you're using, if you're using an RGB case, a lot of times they come with the SATA, which connects and powers the RGB, as well as obviously your fan cables here. Okay, before we install the motherboard into the PC case, we're just going to check what's in the box. So as I mentioned before, most PC cases come with an accessory box. Vantex accessory boxes are usually pretty good. We have our cable ties, which we'll put to one side. As well as that, we have some screws. Yep, so basically, in every PC case, you should get your motherboard screws, fan screws, case screws. To be honest, I would suggest organising the screws before you start your build. It is, quite ideal. Inside the PC case, as I mentioned before, you get your fan screws, so we'll just move them to one side. This is all, the fan screws are just for optional fans. As I mentioned earlier, obviously if you wanted to put an exhaust fan on here, which we are going to do, or any top fans, again exhausting, then you'd want to use these. Just going to pop them to the side, because all we want is the motherboard screws basically. So I'm just going to remove everything that we don't need. Okay, so these are our motherboard screws, and we're going to use these to basically screw the motherboard into our PC case. So we're going to basically install our motherboard. Depending on the PC case you use, will depend on whether or not you have these standoffs already in place. Typically the more budget PC cases will come with additional standoffs, which you actually have to screw in yourself. But when you're looking at like mid to high-end PC cases, then you should get the standoffs already in place, as we do here. So we have no extra standoffs to put in place, and all we need to do is take our motherboard, place it into the PC case, and start screwing it in. This motherboard, the MSI, and all MSIs I think, already come with the back I/O plate already installed. If you're using Asus, then you'll have to reach inside the motherboard box and basically install that yourself on the back of your PC case, which is relatively easy. You just need to make sure that you put it on the right way, so obviously the ports themselves line up with the actual motherboard. Yep, so MSI are great in that they already have this all pre-assembled, so it's really easy to do. When installing the motherboard, you just want to gently place it into the case itself, using the back I/O panel to line up where it should appear, and then inside just basically line up the standoff screws with the holes on the motherboard itself, which should be relatively easy. So you want to line up the standoff screws with the holes in the motherboard itself. Yeah, that's what I'm. Yeah. Next, you take your screwdriver, the motherboard screws, and begin screwing in your motherboard to the PC case. Now, some of you experienced PC builders out there Might be wondering why we've not actually added our CPU cooler on top of our CPU. To be honest, we could have done that outside of the PC case, but due to the fact that we're using an AMD Wraith, which just basically clips onto the default CPU and motherboard brackets, we can actually do that inside the case. One thing we need to address really is, depending on the CPU cooler you're using, I would typically suggest, if you're using a third-party cooler, to install the cooler from outside the case, because you'll probably need access to the back of the motherboard, which with medium and high-end cases, there'll be a cutout on the back, but with budget cases, sometimes you find the back or the side of the PC case doesn't actually have a space for you to access the rear of the motherboard. It's important when screwing in the motherboard that you don't screw the screws in too tight. With a lot of CPU coolers, you'll find that it has thermal paste pre-applied to the bottom of the CPU cooler itself. It's worth checking, because if it doesn't, then you need to apply the thermal paste yourself. So the stock coolers that come with the AMD CPUs have two clips which clip onto the stock CPU motherboard clips on the motherboard. And what you need to do is basically push down and insert one clip on one side. You want to pull back on the black lever. There will be quite a significant amount of resistance. I do recall the first time I did this, I thought I was going to break the CPU itself, but honestly it's fine. And then you want to pull it back all the way over until it's solid and in place. Next, you want to basically put your fan header cable into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Generally these are located at the top of the motherboard and will basically say CPU fan over the top. You'll sometimes also get a pump fan header. Unless you're using an AIO, you can just ignore that one. So there we go, it's put into the fan header, and there we have it. Our motherboard's in the PC case, our CPU cooler's on the CPU, our RAM's installed, SSD's installed. Next up, we're going to install our additional case fan. Now this is not a requirement, obviously depends on the case that you're using and the PC that you're building. We have 3 fans that are intake fans on the front of our case, but we have no exhaust fans. I generally recommend at least adding 1 exhaust fan, as it kind of suggests the main purpose of this fan is to basically extract the hot air from the case, and it will basically remove it from the back, the rear of the case. Obviously if you put it this way, then it's going to remove the air from the inside of the case. If you place it this way, then it's going to try and pull air into the case. The way you can kind of quickly see as to whether or not you're placing it in the right direction is to usually look at your front case fans. Generally speaking, on every case that I've found so far, they will all pull air into the case. So you can kind of match it up and think, well, okay, if I place it this way, then it's going to be obviously pulling air in. When installing additional case fan, you need to make sure that your case fan's cable and the fan header on the motherboard will meet, and that you've got enough length in the actual case fan when you've actually added it to your case. We're going to route our fan cable through the side of our PC case on the P400, and then basically what we're going to do is go through the side here all the way down, and then come back up at the bottom here and place it in one of these system fan headers on the MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi, and we'll start to screw in our case fan to the rear of our case. What I generally do is put 2 diagonal to each other, just so it's attached properly, and then start to apply the force. Next up, we're going to take our case cables and we're going to start plugging these into the motherboard. Okay, first off, we're going to put our reset switch, our HDD LED and our power switch into the motherboard. Don't worry if you don't have the reset switch or the HD LED. Depending on the case, it might just come with a power switch, and it might even come with a few additional ones. Please resort to your motherboard manual for the specific area in which it goes. So we're going to put these in now, through the bottom of the case here. Starting with the power switch. Next, the reset switch, which usually sits just underneath the power switch. Can be a slightly fiddly job. I do sometimes use the light on my mobile phone because it is sometimes quite dark as well. And there we have it. Again, as I mentioned, please refer to your motherboard manual. It will show you a diagram of where each particular switch goes, each cable goes. But generally speaking, the power switch is at the top, the middle two prongs, or the two prongs to the right. The HDD is the bottom left, and the reset switch is directly underneath the power switch. Next, we're going to do the USB 3.0, which is this big blue cable here. Again, straight through the bottom here, twist it up. Sometimes you have to manage these cables quite firmly, especially the USB 3.0. It's quite a tight cable. Push it quite firmly in to the slot. It does have a notch in the middle, so it can only go one way, so don't worry too much. But there we have it. We have our power switch, HDD, LED, our reset switch, and our USB 3.0. Next up is our HD audio. This is for our microphone on our headphone jack on the front of our case. Every single motherboard I've built in to date, the HD audio is always located at the bottom left of the motherboard. So you go to the bottom of the case here. You will find that on the HD audio there is one square block which is blocked out, which basically means that it can only fit in one way. So all you need to do is line this up with the actual HD audio port on the motherboard and gently push that into place. So far we've done the HD audio, the USB 3.0 and our switches for the front of the case. Generally speaking, this is all you'll have on the front. You might also have a SATA cable, in which case we do, which powers the RGB fans. This will be plugged directly into your motherboard via the SATA cable that we'll get later. Okay, next we're going to plug in our fans. We have 3 fans on the front of our case here. These all need to be plugged into our motherboard, into the fan headers that are all located here at the bottom of our motherboard. For this particular case and with this particular build, the 3 fans won't actually reach the 3 fan headers here. So what we use is a fan splitter right here. And what this allows is you to plug 2 fan headers, 2 fan cables, and give you slight extension, which allows on this particular build for us to reach the fan headers here. So we'll take our shortest one, which is here, line it up. Also, another good thing to note is fans sometimes come with 3 pins or 4 pins. If they're 3 pins, then you just line it up with the plastic parts on the top of the fan cable as well as the fan header. If they're 4 pins, then obviously the 4 pins just go into the 4 slots. Next, we will just put this through the bottom of our case here, and then directly into one of our 4 fan headers. Again, depending on the motherboard you use, depends on where the fan headers are located. Generally speaking, you'll have a few fan headers at the bottom. On the Asus one in particular, you have a fan header in the middle here, and on some motherboards you have fan headers next to your 24 pins here. Generally speaking, you will have 3 or 4 fan headers. If you need more, then that's where the fan splitter will come in handy. Our last fan header will just go directly into the motherboard. We won't use a fan splitter for this. And there we go. Our 3 front fans are all plugged in and ready to power. Okay, in today's build we're using the Corsair TX 650 watt semi-modular PSU. Now you might be wondering, what does semi-modular mean? Basically what it means is both your CPU and motherboard cables are already attached to the internal PSU itself. Modular would mean basically that both the CPU and motherboard, you attach them like you do with the PCIe and the SATA cables, and non-modular basically means that you just get an absolute ton of cables and you just have a headache. When choosing your PSU, you need to factor in the power draw of the GPU and the CPU. We're using a 650 watt PSU because we're using a 5700 XT GPU as well as our 3600 CPU. This might be excessive for our current build, but what we're considering is future upgradability. And if we look to upgrade the GPU, for example, that might draw more power. Therefore, we don't have to upgrade the PSU in the future. With all PSUs, you will get your kettle cable, which is basically your plug. Okay, next up, we're going to install the PSU and start wiring our motherboard. So we have our 24 pin and our 8 pin, our motherboard and our CPU cables directly attached to our PSU. And then we have our 3 additional cables here, our SATA cable for our front RGB for the fans. We have our PCIe cable for our graphics card. And we have our Molex cable, which we don't need. On the PSU itself, you'll see a fan. This is the bottom of the PSU, and this should always face the bottom of the PC case. Depending on the PC case that you're using, will depend on whether or not you slide the PSU through the back of the case, or in this case with the Fantex P400, we slide it in the side here. When you begin to install your PSU, you need to keep in mind the cable management on the side of your case. As mentioned earlier, each case comes with different cable management designs. With the Fantex P400, what we have is these Velcro strips and these rubber grommets here. Okay, first up we're going to put the 24 pin into the motherboard. For the 24 pin, on the P400 specifically, we put it through the rubber grommet, twist it, turn it round, and then push it directly into the 24 pin. When you're installing your 24 pin, you should hear a slight click when it lodges into place. Next up, we're going to plug the 8 pin into the CPU port. Again, generally with every motherboard, the CPU power connector is located in the top left of the motherboard. On some of the new motherboards, especially the X570s and the Z490s, you might find that there is 2 8-pin ports. Don't worry, just plug one 8-pin into the left-hand side port. The additional 8-pin port is if you're doing extreme overclocking and need additional power to the motherboard. Now you have your 24 pin and your 8-pin plugged into your motherboard. The next step is any additional SATAs, any additional PCIe or Molex to start plugging these into the appropriate cables. So we'll begin by plugging the SATA cable into our SATA here and plug the SATA side into our PSU, like so. Lastly, we want to power our graphics card. We've yet to install our graphics card, but what we're going to begin by doing is plugging the PCIe side into the power supply. The reason that I plug in the power supply cables first is generally because once you've actually put the power supply inside the case, it's extremely difficult to locate and to see where to plug them in. Now we're going to basically put our power supply inside our case, slide it in here, taking the power supply screws that came with the PC case, line up the power supply and begin screwing. Generally, you just need to add 4 screws. Sometimes you can add 6, but it doesn't need it. Now the power supply has been screwed into the case, the next job is to install our graphics card. Now, depending on the PC case that you're using, as well as the graphics card that you're using, will depend on how many of these expansion slots at the back you're going to remove. We're using the 5700 XT, which is a space of 2 expansion slots. So we need to take out the second and the third. Here we have our 5700 XT by Asus, the ROG Strix version. With the GPU, you'll have a small rubber protection on the bottom of the GPU. That's to basically protect the PCIe. And in some cases you'll have a removable plastic on the rear, as well as potentially stickers on the fan itself, and in some cases stickers on the top. So please just check your GPU and check for any removable plastic before you actually install it and turn it on for the first time. So what we're going to do is push down the clip on our top PCIe port, I always remove the top plastic of the port on the back of the I/O. The reason being, in some cases, I find that it hits the actual case and stops you from pushing it in properly. And then next, it's just line up the PCIe with the card and then gently push it into place. You'll hear a click and the clip on the PCIe port will click back into place. Your GPU is now in place and you can go ahead and reattach the screws on the back of the case. Now that we've installed our GPU, we need to power it. For this, we move to the back of our case, or the side of our case, back to the PCIe cable that we attached to the PSU before, and we push it through the grommet on the case itself, through the front side of the case, so that we can now begin to install it onto our GPU. You just need to push the pins together. It'll have a slight clip on it where you line it in place, hold the case and push it in. And then do the same again, push it in, and you'll know it's in place once the clip on the cable has gone above the clip on the actual GPU itself. Okay, now we need to do a little bit of cable management, tidy up the cables on the left side panel of the case. You'll need a few cable ties, a little bit of patience, and begin to cable manage. Okay, so cable management done. What I've done basically is cable tied the 24 pin alongside the case cables as well as the SATA cable and a few of the other cables. I've also bunched up a lot of the cables here, which is basically a daisy chain of the RGB cables for the front fans. They've just been bunched up and pushed at the top because we don't actually need to install any of those cables, they're just a daisy chain. As well as that, I've used the Velcro straps to help manage the additional cables we have. Down the bottom here, not as much cable management has been done. Main reason for that is simply because you don't see this from the front or the right exterior of the case itself. For the CPU cable, we've just basically cable tied this to the external fan, the exhaust fan that we put on before. And there we have it. This is pretty much all you need to do for cable management if you are looking to do any sort of cable management. So yeah. So now we're going to put the sides of the case on and plug it in. If you want to find out more about how to install Windows, then check out wepc.com. If you want to follow our in-depth written guide, then again, check out wepc.com. If you want links to any of the products that we've used in today's video, check out the YouTube description below. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment below, and hit the notification button so you never miss a video.